I wish everybody watched several news broadcasts, read a good local newspaper, read the news weeklies, read some journals of opinion. The facts of the matter are they don't.
Right.
So we have to realize that there are some Americans, and it is something over 50%, I didn't know that latest figure, who say that they get their news from television.
I don't think we can be totally objective in anything these days. You give the same story to 4 different reporters with the same facts, the same happenings, and they'll come up with a different twist, a different lead to that story. And that's good, because I think that they report that story based on their feelings, their experiences, what they know about the incident, and it'll be different each and every time, and I hope that never changes. However, if you avoid objectivity, you certainly cannot avoid fairness and balance in reporting a story. We can never lose that. That may sound a little Pollyanna, but...
News. That's a word we hear countless times every day. We may read a newspaper while we eat breakfast or after dinner in the evening. We listen to the news on the radio. At work, there's the company newsletter. But most of us get the news from television. An early morning newscast, the kind we listen to more than watch, helps us start off the day by informing us about what's gone on during the night. If we're home during the day, we might catch more television news around the noon hour. But it's in the evening when most Americans turn on the television to really get filled in on what's been going on. It's just human nature to be curious. That's the basic reason we turn on the news. We all seek knowledge. We're inquisitive. We want to learn. That's part of being a thinking individual. We seek to know what's new in order to understand our environment. We need to know what's happened because the events of the day are important to each of us in lesser or greater degrees, but they are important. Newspapers, radio, and magazines, they all lose out to television as the primary source of news in this country. And that's why we're going to concentrate today on television news.
Back in 1959, the Television Information Office, which is sponsored by the broadcast industry, hired Roper Research Associates, the eminent firm of pollsters, to keep an eye on television news and measure how much the population of the country watched it and believed in it. Their survey was a comparative one, taken over a period of 12 years.
Which source of news do people feel is the most reliable? The Roper survey asked this question. If you got conflicting or different reports of the same news story from radio, television, the magazines, and the newspapers, which of the 4 versions would you be most inclined to believe? When the Roper study came out the first year, back in 1959, newspapers beat out television, but just barely. In just 2 years, however, in 1961, television news became the winner. Most people choose television as being more reliable than what they read in papers or magazines or hear on the radio. It's been that way ever since 1959.
Such belief in the believability of what we see on the evening news, such reliance on only one source for news, that makes a lot of people nervous.
In his famous Iowa speech in November of 1969, former Vice President Spiro Agnew lambasted the networks and their anchormen, accusing them of distortion of the news. Of television itself, Agnew said, no medium has a more powerful influence over public opinion. Nowhere in our system are there fewer checks on vast power.
The battle lines were drawn, particularly after Agnew expanded his remarks beyond television to include all journalists, no matter what their medium. Politicians and the press are natural enemies. Freedom of the press is guaranteed, however, by the First Amendment to the Constitution. But just what that really means to the press and the public is an argument that will probably go on forever. Agnew accused television news of bias, and most of us get our only view of the larger world from that medium, television.
I wish everybody watched several news broadcasts, read a good local newspaper, read the news weeklies, read some journals of opinion. The facts of the matter are they don't.
Right.
So We have to realize that there are some Americans, and it is something over 50%, I didn't know that latest figure, who say that they get their news from television, a combination of local and national and the 3 networks. Well, it's a responsibility. I don't think it's awesome. It doesn't worry me. I wish we did our job better. I wish American print journalism did its job better. But I am convinced that we have got the best informed mass citizenry in history. And I think a good deal of credit for that can go to American network television news, which has given the country for the first time a kind of national newspaper.
We see all these surveys saying that more people today look to television for their main source of information. And I suppose we should be overjoyed about that, but actually it scares us, because no way can a person be totally informed by watching television news every day, day in and day out, and have that tube poured at them. They have to go elsewhere for the details. We're a headline service, primarily. Hopefully, we can get people interested in the issues and what's happening, and then hopefully they'll dig further and read more about it. You know, maybe at the end of a newscast we ought to say, hey, you haven't heard it all, because we can't give it to you. We have, what, in a half hour of news block, 15 minutes to tell the people what happened in the whole world today? Well, no way are you going to do it. But hopefully we can get them interested in what's happening. We can do things that newspapers can't do.
How do news stories get chosen to be put on the air? What is news? And what criteria are used to choose between stories? Some folks might think that there are hundreds of stories to choose from every day, but that's not quite the case.
Some days you wonder how the devil you're going to fill 23 minutes. But the main criteria that we do use on days when there has to be a choice, and obviously that includes a lot of days. One, we feel it's our obligation to assume that there's a certain number of people out there who get all their news from the ABC Evening News, as I assume any editor would feel. So one criteria is to keep people up to date on things that are obviously important to them and their way of life or their responsibility as citizens. That's one. Second is, do we have it? A story which is, say, marginal becomes more important to us in our selectivity if we had a reporter on the scene and have some good pictures of it, or a good report on it, and sometimes we don't. And I suppose third then would be the question of just basic interest. There are some things that you cannot justify in any form of journalism on the basis of, is it world-shaking? Does it affect the way you're going to vote? Is it going to affect your life in the years to come?
When we first started, you know, we had readers, people who just got on the air and read the news. That's changed through the years, and thank God it has, because the newscaster you see now on most stations, if not all, are reporters. They maybe they haven't been on the particular story they're reporting at that moment, but they are reporters. They've been out on the street. They've been talking to people who make the news. They write news. That didn't used to be true. And as I say, I'm glad that has changed, because when somebody sees an anchorman or a newscaster, they should know now that man is also a reporter, or that woman.
But what is news? What is there in an occurrence that turns it into a news story? David Brinkley has defined news as being the unusual, the unexpected. Placidity is not news, according to Brinkley. If an airplane departs on time and arrives on time, it isn't news. If it crashes, regrettably, it is.
To define a news story, journalists have evolved a checklist of values. A good news story has to have at least one of them. Timeliness usually leads the list. If it isn't timely, it may not be news, it may be history instead. Proximity is another news value. If the story happens close to us, it's news.
What are the implications of a story? That's another important consideration.
The prominence of the people involved is another factor.
Some stories are news, and yet they don't fit into any of these categories. They're just human interest stories.
It's just something that is of interest to us. We feel would be of interest to somebody else. And it isn't we try to work them in, it's that I don't mind them. I don't feel everything has to be portentous and world-shaking.
What makes the news? All those elements may go into a story that's newsworthy, but a story must have at least one of them. If they're all missing, it's not news. An offshoot in any discussion of what is news is the question about good news or bad news. Does a story have to have a sad or tragic ending in order for it to be news? Can't a happy ending also be news? When Walter Cronkite was asked about reporting good news, he responded by saying, "It's a little like having to report all the cats that aren't lost that day."
Professional journalists share a consensus of what constitutes news. That's their business and what they were trained for. That industry-wide nose for news often results in striking similarities in lead stories and headlines.
I think if you took three experienced editors or journalists of any kind from whatever medium and asked them to make up a front page or a news broadcast on any given night, there'd be a large measure of the same stories appearing. We think we know what ought to be in.
A television newscast is a reporting of the news, a distilling, picking, and choosing the appropriate words and pictures to describe the top stories of the day. However, when it comes to coverage of something as it happens, Watergate hearings or landing on the moon, that's when the viewer is presented not with a reporter's version of the story, but with the actual event itself, the kind of thing at which television excels. There's no interpreter between the viewer and the event. Most times, however, stories are interpreted for us. They come to us as someone's version. Broadcast journalists recognize their responsibility in that, to be fair to all sides, they must report all sides of the story.
We report the news. We do our very best to find everything out about that story, get all the facts on it. If it's a controversial issue, try to get all sides to the issue. And it's labeled as news. If we do make an editorial remark, it's so labeled as an editorial. If it's a commentary, it's so labeled. And I think we have to do that for people because it can get one big muddle if we don't.
I don't think there are very many conscious attempts to be objective. There are some second guessings on our part, sometimes the part of our executives, but mainly in your own soul searching the day after, did you do it right? At the time you're trying to get a piece of news on, the decisions you make or the arguments you make are usually instinctive, but they tend to be professional.
NBC's David Brinkley has, on occasion, been accused of being less than objective in his reporting style. Brinkley explained that to be objective, you would have to have no likes, no dislikes, no feelings, no views, no values, no standards, to be a machine. If he were objective, said Brinkley, he'd have to be put away someplace in an institution as some sort of vegetable. Brinkley went on, objectivity is impossible to a normal human being. Fairness, however, is attainable, and that's what we strive for.
Ivan and Carol Doig describe further reactions to Brinkley's style in their book, News, A Consumer's Guide. The Doigs are both journalists and teachers of journalism. They write, David Brinkley of NBC News at times has been charged with bias for the way he raises an eyebrow or in tones of phrase. After videotaping some of his reports and replaying them for friends and students, we're convinced that Brinkley could sit mute and immovable before an audience and still be accused of prejudicing the news.
Television news is important to all of us, and most telecasters recognize the responsibility that they hold. But there's still argument and discussion. The critics of television news may not be as loud or as clever as Spiro Agnew was in stringing his ideas and thoughts together, but the critics are still there. Some people are definitely concerned that television newscasters just aren't doing their jobs. Let's take a close look, in the proper broadcast way, at both sides of that argument. A little observance of the fairness doctrine right here and now. The subject is freedom of the press, a big and important one.
The First Amendment to the Constitution spells it out. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. That's the first article of the Bill of Rights and can't be taken lightly. Any attempt by government to control the news is obviously illegal and unconstitutional. If a government can control what people know about it, it follows that they can control the people. Successful dictatorships are founded on management and suppression of the news media.
George Reedy is Dean of the College of Journalism at Marquette University and a former press secretary for President Lyndon Johnson. He wrote a book called Twilight of the Presidency, and in it he said, there are very few politicians who do not cherish privately the notion that there should be some regulation of the news. If censorship ever comes to the United States, it will explode out of the frustrations of a political leader convinced that the public good is being thwarted by self-serving reporters distorting the news.
Censorship is an ugly word, an un-American word, if you will. Challenges to the right of freedom of the press have always been with us, and press reaction to those who threaten First Amendment rights is strong.
Because I am against anything which reduces First Amendment privileges for any element of the press. And secondly, I am against anything which does exist, which treats broadcast journalism differently from print journalism. And this is not to say the press is perfect, but in all of the areas where there's some question about how we have behaved, in the questions of First Amendment versus Fifth Amendment and Sixth Amendment and trials and so on, it seems to me you would be a lot worse off if somebody other than ourselves were regulating ourselves. And secondly, that the main problems, for instance, in trials, 95% of the problems in relation to fair trials arise from judges and attorneys, not from the press.
That's very true. Critics of television news have made some interesting speculations about our Constitution. They suggest that the founders of this nation could never have envisioned the day when one person would simultaneously talk to and be seen by 50 or 60 million people, maybe even more. Wise as they were, the framers of the Constitution never foresaw the immense power of television. If they had, critics suggest that they might have placed some kind of check on such great power. Our whole system of government depends upon a set of checks and balances. The president is checked by the courts, and the courts by the other branches. But who checks the news media? It can be argued that the press is not part of government, and so it doesn't need any checks or restraints. But in many ways, the power of the press is equal to the power of any government agency. By controlling what we know, by interpreting events for us, can't the press do the same thing that we fear from government? Can't they actually create or destroy issues or people just by the stories they use? If that's true, then the press is actually in control of government. Well, many people suggest this is exactly the way it must be, that a free press should control government to keep it honest and representative. But that brings up another question. Who checks the honesty and objectivity of the press? What if a network, or a single television reporter for that matter, were to be less than honest? What can be done? Well, there are safeguards to maintain a high level of professionalism and honesty in television news. And three of them come to mind immediately. There's competition, there's the basic professional honesty of newscasters, and there are some outside regulatory agencies.
The competition is tough in television news. Look at the closing credits on the end of a newscast and count the names. Count them for the network newscasts and the local newscasts, too. The top jobs, the ones in front of the camera, are so few compared to all the other positions held by people who are ready and willing to take over on camera, should the on-camera personality not be honest and forthright in presenting a story. The on-camera reporter has to perform, or someone else will be given the job.
Competition exists not only within a news staff, but also between news departments in the stations in town, and between the news departments on the network level, too. If one individual should slant the news, the public will catch on fast.
Almost all American cities of any size at all now have their choice of 3 network news broadcasts, which, while they cover the same areas, are different and are independent, which means that you are not the prisoner of your local news anymore, newspaper or television. You can turn to the networks. The networks have maintained an independent and professional attitude. So I think we fulfill the responsibility within the limits of the present state of the art. It's not that we are handicapped by anyone telling us what to do or by our own venality. We are still limited by our lack of perfection.
Newscasters, good ones, all have a great sense of honesty, pride in their work, and a definite professional sense of responsibility to their viewers.
You know, I think we've got some pretty responsible people in this business of reporting. Hey, they're citizens of this country, too, and they want things done right. And, you'll always find some charlatans in any business, but I think for the most part, it's in good hands, really.
Television news departments, particularly on the local level, must rely on the national wire services for their stories on what's going on out in the world. The television news services in this country supply stories which give information which must be believed by the local news people because, in the interests of both time and money, they just can't send out a reporter to the four corners of the country or the world to check out the facts. A story that originates in outer Mongolia, for example, might be taken, at least locally, on faith.
We go back in our newsroom and we have an Associated Press wire. We have a United Press International wire. Well, we use what comes across that wire. Do we know it's fact? Not really, but we have to rely on the people who put that news on that wire. We get to meet some of them now and then and get to know them as people, but we worry sometimes. Are they giving us the facts of a story? And then we do all we can to the best of our ability to find out if what is coming across the wire is for real. Locally, of course, we have total control of that. A network feeds their program down the line. Again, you hope that you have responsible people, and I think we do for the most part. And you try to get to know them. You get to try to get to know a Harry Reasoner, Walter Cronkite, and you find out they're pretty good people, and they wouldn't stand for any hanky-panky and playing with that news, playing with the facts.
There are some outside regulatory agencies which have varying degrees of control over the airways. First and foremost is the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. The FCC has the ultimate power of being able to revoke a station's license to broadcast. This has direct effect on a local station and its news department, but an indirect effect on the networks which do not need a license. Another organization is also involved in protecting both freedom of the press and in checking into complaints of press distortions.
The News Council is an ombudsman, a public body to stand between the press and the public to examine complaints about accuracy or fairness in reporting. The idea being that the press has grown to such dimensions in this country that the public has lost contact directly with it. And this is to try and get over areas of mistrust involving the press and the public.
The National News Council was founded just a few years ago, modeled after the British Press Council. It has no legal powers whatsoever. As Ned Schnorman says, it's a force for ventilation, not regulation. If a complaint is found to be valid, the findings are published. The council has 18 members, half from the general public, half from the press. Registering a complaint with the National News Council is a simple thing.
What you'd have to do would be to write to the National News Council at 1 Lincoln Plaza in New York and say, here's a documentary on X network. In this portion of it, when they were showing something on an element of American life, they made a mistake or they portrayed it inaccurately in the way they put it together. Assuming that had some solid factual base, we would then take it and do some homework with it. We would, of course, send it to the network for their response, or you might write to them directly and send us a copy. That's really what we prefer, because that establishes the kind of communication there ought to be. It really turns out that when you write to them and copy us, their tendency to respond to you is greater than if you write to them and don't copy us.
Yes.
So that starts the mechanism. And after that, the council staff makes an examination of your factual allegations, and if they feel that it's substantial enough, brings it to the attention of the council's grievance committee when it meets, and they in turn make a recommendation to the full council.
The grievance committee of the council acts in a manner comparable to a subcommittee of a full congressional committee. If the grievance committee finds that your complaint has foundation, it's then turned over to the full committee for further action. But a finding by the National News Council contains more than just the verdict.
What we try to do in these findings is not only say, yes, that was inaccurate, the complaint is warranted, or no, it was unwarranted, but explain journalistic principles that are involved here. People often don't understand, for example, deadlines. They don't understand the pressures that film makers and documentarians are under, and they don't understand the pressures that local news organizations are under. And all of those things we try to explain in the findings we make. And I'm not only talking about television now. It's certainly true of newspapers, too. News, after all, is something that you see at the moment. It often changes in perspective. Yes. That doesn't mean the paper was wrong on the day that it reported something, although the facts may be 180 degrees the other way a week from then. They simply are signaling an event that took place. And so you try to explain those things to people, and hopefully the wire services and others are here covering the story. The story gets national, our meeting gets national distribution.
So there you have it. Government control of the press could destroy the country, but an unchecked press could do the same thing. The answer lies with all of us as viewers and voters. We all need to be constantly aware of the awesome power that television news in particular, and all news media as well, have over our view of the world. When watching television, we need to be more critical of stories that make the news. Just because it's on television doesn't mean that it's absolutely true. We humans are such creatures of habit. We do the same thing every day, read the same newspapers, watch the same newscast, or listen to them on the radio. We get tied into a routine, into the same sources, every day supplying us with our view of the world. I'd like to recommend change. Don't watch the same network every day or the same local newscast. Switch around and compare. Learn to recognize when a reporter is giving you the straight facts and when you're getting personal opinion. Eric Severide's remarks are always prefaced with the introduction that says, "this commentary." But that doesn't always happen with news people of lesser renown. Learn to distinguish objective reporting from subjective analysis. As I said, we also have a responsibility as voters. We must learn to demand honesty and accountability from our elected officials. An honest man has nothing to fear from a free press. Let's hold our public officials to that principle. Let's let them defend themselves against press coverage that's negative, but let's also consider the viability of what the press has to say. As with most other forms of communication, what happens with television news, what the future will hold is up to all of us. If we learn to demand objectivity and honesty, we'll get it. If we're willing to be led down any path, we'll have only ourselves to blame. We must steadfastly hold all our leaders, elected or otherwise, accountable for what they say or do. That's what democracy is all about. It's the one good way to preserve both free government and free press.